So it's our great pleasure to have Professor Clint Penick. He's from the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Organismal Biology at Kennesaw State University. Clint got his undergraduate degree with Walter Tschinkel, who wrote this huge book on fire ants. Great guy at Florida State University back in 2005. Then he went to Arizona State University to work with Jürgen Liebig. How do you pronounce that?
Close enough. Jürgen Liebig.
Jürgen Liebig. Then he did his postdoc with Rob Dunn over at NC State. He's also worked at ASU's Global Institute for Sustainability with Biomimicry 3.8. Yeah. And then he came to Kennesaw State as assistant research professor in 2017 and as assistant professor in 2019. So he'll be here, be with us, visiting with us throughout the day. And it's our great pleasure to sort of have him at Georgia Tech. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for the introduction, David. Yeah. All right. We're all good? Okay. Yeah, so thank you all for coming. Today I'm going to be talking about work that I never thought I would be doing as a biologist. We have had funding from NASA with a collaboration with some engineers, looking at insect species, some insect biodiversity, and looking at how that could inspire applications in aerospace design. And so most of my lab actually does not work on this. Most of us work on pretty traditional ecology. I do work in urban ecology. So in 2 weeks, I'm going to be flying to my main field site, which is New York City. And so we do a lot of work on diversity patterns and drivers of biodiversity. In New York so far, we've identified, these are headshots of all the ant species. We have 40 ant species that live in New York City. In the last year, we've undertaken a similar study in Atlanta, so we're now combing through all of our Atlanta data. We obviously are going to have more. We're going to win over New York. We have probably at least 50 or 60 species, if not a lot more. But in looking at biodiversity, and it's something I'm passionate about. I think a lot of us as biologists, got in this field thinking about conservation and all these other things. Instead of just describing patterns in biodiversity, I wanted to look back what we could actually learn from some of these species and then pull them back into the human realm. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Our two projects in bio-inspired design. The first is going to be looking at honeycomb and applications in 3D printing design. And then the second one is going to be work on cuticle sculpturing in ants that we've been doing in my lab, and particularly a little bit how we're looking at that with abrasion resistance. So starting with honeycomb, this project came about in my lab almost as an accident. So I happened to be sitting next to a 3D printing engineer on a airport shuttle. And as we were going back, we started talking. That engineer is this fella here, Dhruv Bhatte. He's at Arizona State University. And one of the main things that he was working on was 3D printing honeycomb. And then when he found out that I was a biologist and study bees, and he thought, oh, let's get together, let's collaborate. I'm sure we can figure out something that we can look at honeycomb made by bees and that we could then learn something from it. At that time, I was pretty skeptical, but I thought, yeah, sure, like I can bring some. I was still at Arizona State then, so I was like, I can bring some comb over to your lab and we can talk. But I was like, what is there that we could really learn about this? It's already a really simple structure. It's just hexagons repeated. And on top of that, people have been looking at honeycomb for literally over 2,000 years. And so it goes back to this Roman general / scholar named Marcus Terentius Varro, who in 36 BC came up with this concept called the honeycomb conjecture. So Varro, he's kind of this interesting fella. He, in between waging a civil war against Julius Caesar, he kept bees on the side and then wrote about agriculture. And at the time, the number one hypothesis for why bees build hexagonal comb was that hexagons have 6 sides, bees have 6 legs. End of story. That was kind of it. They were like 6 and 6 go together. They had a little bit of mechanistic understanding of it, but not too much deep thought about it. And so Varro, what he proposed, which is now known as the honeycomb conjecture, was that bees choose the hexagon because it is the most efficient shape to divide up space into equal area. So you use less material to divide up space into equal cells. And this is important to the bees because they actually produce wax, they secrete it. So they have glands on the underside of their abdomen, these wax glands, and so these are what they look like. These wax scales come out, and then they wipe those off, and then they use that to construct their comb. The rule of thumb is that it takes 10 pounds of honey that bees have to consume in order to make 1 pound of wax. more or less. So this is really a really expensive process for the bees, and it's especially important during the early colony founding stages when bees have to basically build a complete nest overnight when they move to a new colony. So for that reason, it would make sense for them to for selection to cause bees to use the least amount of wax possible. So this honeycomb conjecture stayed just that for many years. It stayed a conjecture, but then literally 2,000 years later in 2000 AD, this mathematician Thomas Hales finally proved that this is correct. And so Thomas Hales figured out that the hexagon is indeed the most efficient shape to divide up space. He compared it to the three regular shapes that make perfect tessellation. So this is squares, triangles, and hexagons. And so hexagons beat these others. But he also showed that even these kind of crazy Voronoi structures that are more irregular, but those are also less efficient than the hexagon in dividing up space. So based on all of this, it very strong support that the honeycomb conjecture is correct and that the hexagon is this most efficient shape. So this matters to bees, but also it has had a lot of engineering applications. So honeycomb is used pretty widely in the engineering industry. They're called honeycomb core panels or sandwich panels. And so what you do, what they produce is these, there's sort of two pieces of metal, and then in between them is honeycomb. It's very important in aerospace. So these honeycomb panels wrap the wings. So the wings are wrapped in honeycomb panels. The fuselage is generally wrapped in honeycomb as well. And even when you have to put your luggage in one of those overhead bins, the door on that overhead bin is filled with honeycomb panel. They basically use it everywhere in aerospace. And it's for the same reason the bees do, more or less. It's that it provides some structural support, but it uses the least amount of material to do so. And so when you have a plane that wants to fly, it's good for it to be lightweight. So honeycomb has a very high strength to weight ratio compared to other materials. So all this was known before Dhruv and I started on our project. When I visited his lab, he showed me some of the comb that they 3D print. So his specialty is 3D printing metals. And so when they 3D print comb, and in most of these honeycomb panels, it looks fairly similar. You have these very regular hexagons, and they have very sharp angles, and everything is kind of perfectly created. When we zoomed in and looked at the bees, they obviously don't look like this. So this is a picture of bee honeycomb. Also, it's still pretty regular. If you look at individual parts, there's some variation in size, and some cells have different numbers of sides. But for the most part, they build pretty regular honeycomb. But one of the things that we noticed was different is that when you look at those angles, they aren't sharp at all. They have a little bit of curvature in them. And Dhruv thought maybe this is important. Maybe there's something going on with that. And so we ended up calling this corner radius. So this is, we measure that corner angle or that rounding based on the radius of a circle that would inscribe it. So what Dhruv ended up doing was printing out a series of squares with honeycomb and then varying that angle. So on the upper left there, you have sharp angled honeycomb. And then we kept adding a little bit more rounding on the bottom right. They're almost complete circles in there in the honeycomb. And we put them on a hydraulic press. This is all nylon, but these nylon panels, and we crush them. And then basically calculated stress strain curves on these to see how adding that corner rounding changed the mechanical properties of the comb. You can't really see anything really great in these videos, but they're pretty cool, so I like to show them. One of the things that always comes up is that for the bees, probably compression forces aren't as important. It's probably more that they have self-loading, and so there's more tension forces. But thankfully, the area that we care about, whether you compress it or pull it apart, they tend to have the same properties in the stress strain curve. So this is a stress strain curve. This is the data that comes out of this. I'm a biologist. I think it took me 6 months before I finally could kind of understand what these were. So I'm going to try to explain them to you as I explain them to myself to understand them. So to the bees, what really matters is not this whole curve. The curve is really important for engineers, for other things, but what we focus on is really this bottom part here. And this is called the elastic phase of the stress strain curve. And basically the slope of that line, it's more or less a linear line going up. That's how you calculate Young's modulus, which is a measure of stiffness. So where that slope is steeper, you have higher stiffness. And so the white one on the top is the most rounded. So as we add rounding to the corners, we increase stiffness. The other thing that's interesting is where that line goes from linear and then deflects and start to round off. That's called the yield point. And that's the point at which the honeycomb fails and then cracks develop and then it no longer functions. And for the bees, they don't care. There's a bunch of other things you can measure on the other side. Uh-oh, let's turn it off. It looks like it's reconnecting to the network. Should I just wait a second? Oh, okay. That. Okay. And there we go. Oh, I have to share screen again. Okay. Here. There we go. Okay. That should work. Hopefully they can hear me back again. We had Wi-Fi cut out. Can they can't see this yet. Did it work? Oh. Click here to start. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so the other thing that you see here is that the point at which these honeycombs fail, if they have that rounding in the corner, they can take a lot more of that compression, a lot more of that stress before they fail. So these two things are probably important to bees. They're certainly important to engineering. So just adding a little bit of material increases stiffness, and it increases overall strength before failure. And this is interesting because, so typically if you don't, when engineers design these panels, they've never really included this rounding before. So the only way to increase stiffness, if they need to increase stiffness of a structure, is to make the walls thicker. And as you make the walls thicker and thicker, that also increases stiffness, and that also decreases the failure. So it increases that yield strength as well. But this also has the problem of adding a lot more material, so it makes it heavier. And so what we found is that you can just add a little bit of material in the corners, and you can achieve some of the same level of these improvements in stiffness and strength without adding more material. So like right off the bat, this was pretty cool. When we discovered this, we were able to write a proposal to NASA, and then we got like a phase one NASA STTR funding to work with a company to try to figure out how to optimize this and use it to develop lighter weight aerospace parts. That was the focus for this project. And so what we did with the company focused on building models in ANSYS. So ANSYS is one of the main design tools for engineering. And so you can engineer parts, you can design parts, you can design bridges, you can do all these different things. And then one of the things in ANSYS is it has a little button, so you can design a part in 3 dimensions, and you can click a button and say, fill it with honeycomb. And that already existed. And then what our innovation was to try to work over this with NASA and this company, Ph.D, to then add another button that would say optimize the factors of the honeycomb to meet whatever stiffness requirements there were using the least amount of material. And so what we wanted to get out of this on the engineering side was figuring out how thick the walls should be and how much rounding should be in the corners if you want to achieve maximum stiffness using the least amount of material. So that's cool, and I was excited to see that this come through, but I'm a biologist again. And so I wanted to see if we could then do that and then look back at the bees and then see if we could learn that are bees actually optimizing these parameters for stiffness? Are they doing this as well? And so our first question, I'm going to go through a series of questions here in this project. The first one is there an optimum corner radius for maximizing stiffness while minimizing material, so optimizing strength to weight ratios? And then the second question is, do bees follow this? If this does exist, are bees building their comb by optimizing their strength to weight ratios as well? So we went back to that ANSYS model. This was a computer model, so we look at an individual cell, and we ran 400 iterations. We had applied pressure both the top-down side and the left-right side, the longitudinal and transverse planes. And then we varied corner rounding and thickness, both for all of these trials. We applied, a constant compressive strain across those two axes. And then we modeled this response in ANSYS using nylon 12, but then we corrected for material qualities. So all of the data that I'm going to show you after are material agnostic. So these same patterns should hold up if you do it with steel, nylon, beeswax, whatever you use, the properties should be the same. Okay, and so these are the figures that the engineers spit out. And again, I think it took me 6 months to figure out how to read this, so I'm going to try to simplify it. I think engineers might know what all these things mean. I still probably could not explain that y-axis to you in a reasonable way. So basically what we have on one axis, we have increased corner radius. So it goes from 0 corner rounding to basically a complete circle. So a sharp corner to a complete circle. And then we have wall thickness that increases from really thin walls to really thick walls. And then stiffness is on the y-axis. This is technically something called the geometric efficiency of stiffness. So this is the maximum stiffness while minimizing material. So this is the most kind of lightweight. This has the highest strength to weight ratio as you go up that x-axis, increasing strength to weight ratios. And what we found when we plotted on this is that basically you increase stiffness as you make the walls thicker, which we know. And then we also saw that as you add more and more corner rounding and approach that perfectly round circle, then you also increase stiffness. And this was actually what we found in general is if you care about maximizing stiffness, you should always build cells with a perfect circle. It should be perfect rounding. There should be no kind of angle. And this was interesting to see that this was true, but it was also kind of disheartening because, like I said, we wanted to make this button that optimized these parameters, but you don't even need that, right? So based on this, you just need to always make the corner rounding the maximum. It should basically be a perfect circle. So when we went to that first question, is there an optimum corner radius for maximizing stiffness? Yes, there is. It's just one, always. No matter how thick your walls are, you're always just going to make it perfectly round. And then our second question is, do bees do this? No. So I showed you what bee comb looks like. I'm not going to go into the details here, but sometimes they build perfect circles, but more often than not, they're not perfect circles. And so we were like, okay, well, this is kind of boring. I mean, I guess it's good for manufacturing. If you care about that, you can do this. It's fairly easy to implement. But it didn't tell us too much about the bees, and it didn't make a complicated solution that we could then sell, that company could sell to ANSYS or whatever. But we didn't stop there. So the engineers kept working on this, and they thought, well, stiffness is one parameter that we might care about. Another one is stress mitigation, and so this is where cracks start in a process, and when cracks start, basically that's when the panel will fail. And so what you can see on the left is a model that has perfectly rounded corners, and so as you apply that compressive strength, a little thing here, you get right here, this really dark red, that bright red section, that's where you have the maximum stress. And so once you have that, what you have is a crack that propagates, and then once you get one crack in this, then the whole thing starts to collapse and then fail. Then if you model this by adding a little bit of corner rounding, what happens is that it diffuses that stress, and so it reduces it. So instead of having a bright red spot where a crack forms, here it's just in the yellow, and then it moves it to the sides. And more as you add this, it decreases the stress points, and this could then increase yield strength, so in addition to stiffness. So we did the same thing with this. We ran those 400 iterations and then looked at the effects on stress. And this is what the graph looks like. Again, the axes are very complex, so I'm going to simplify them here. So it's basically the same. We have corner radius and wall thickness on the two axes, and then on the y-axis we have stress instead of stiffness. And then here what we found was actually pretty interesting. So now we do have an optimum. It falls more or less on this line, so this is the minimum stress line. And what's kind of interesting about this is that when you have really thin walls, so if you have a thin-walled hexagon structure, it actually is best to have sharp corners and not have that corner rounding. If you add corner rounding, actually with thin walls, it increases stress and they start to buckle earlier. And so that's a bad thing to do. And then as you move to thicker and thicker walls relative to the size of the cell, what that does is then we see this benefit of adding that corner rounding in there. So this is an optimum, and so this is something that we could plug back into ANSYS. And so if you're looking at trying to maximize stiffness and also minimize stress, if you follow this line, this is the primary thing that would actually provide a benefit there. I think partly because it redirects the energy to another point on the wall, and so it fractures in a different spot. And it's easier to fracture the thin walls on the side than it is to have a crack form right at those angles.
So that picture you showed of the stress function.
Yeah, so if I went back here, like where the crack would form would be right here. But if you add rounding, then the crack starts to form here. And so if you have really thin walls, that's where the crack will form. And I think that's what it kind of moves that stress to an area where it's weaker. Just given like the beams are stronger at either end, and they're more likely to crack in the middle in general. Does that make sense? This is a biologist explanation. So, okay. I think that's what's going on. All right, so now we have this minimum stress line. So if we go back to our third question, do bees build comb using optimal corner radius to decrease corner stress? Sorry, this is the new question. So we know that now there's an optimum. Now we want to see if bees do this. So we figured it out for the material, and so they were able to plug this into ANSYS. But now we want to see if bees are following this same response. So to do this, we worked at the ASU Bee Lab and had a series of 10 colonies produce new comb for us with top bar frames. So these, we wanted to use comb. We wanted to use fresh comb, so we knew they were all relatively the same age. And then typically beekeepers will put like a plastic backing that already has kind of the impressions of the hexagons in it, and then that influences the bee's behavior. So we wanted to remove that. So what we did is we just had them basically build more or less natural comb from these. And then we took these and then we measured. So we put them under a Keon's imaging system, and then we measured individual cells. We focused on the most regular cells. So cells can get weird where those different lobes of comb join together. So we focused kind of away from there. And then we measured 3 traits. We measured the cell diameter, so just the size of the cell. We measured the wall thickness, as you can see there in T, and then corner radius. And so what's nice about Keon's, their system has ways that can kind of automate this and take out a little bit of the bias that someone who's trying to manually measure this would have in there. And so then we plotted this. So we looked at relative wall thickness. So this is thickness divided by cell diameter. And then because that's what kind of matches the model that I showed previous. And then we looked at corner radius, and that's normalized corner radius. So it's the corner radius divided by the cell radius. So if the corner radius is a perfect circle, then those would cancel out and equal 1. So that's basically, so that's what we have. So it's a range of 0 corner rounding to a perfect circle on the y-axis. And so our prediction is if they are following what we see from the engineering model, that when they build thinner walled cells at the far end of that x-axis over there, then they should not be putting much corner rounding in. And as they get thicker and thicker cells, then they should increase corner rounding. So this is the data from our bees. So it was actually significant. So it supported the hypothesis, but it's pretty messy. And so this wasn't very strong support that bees were doing anything with this. For the most part, almost all of them stay below that full circle radius. But one of the things that I wanted to point out is that we measured both brood cells and drone cells. So drone cells are a little bit bigger, so we had some variation here, but this is only one species. Most of the cells are very similar to each other, and we thought, well, maybe you wouldn't see this within a species. There's not a ton of variation there in our wall thickness. Yeah. Short, yeah, and that's a good question. So if you leave comb in we've done measurements on relatively old comb, multiple years old, and they add thickness every year. And so for these, they were, I think, like a month after they started building is when we imaged them. And the reason why we did that is because we think the selection pressure is probably largest during the early stages of comb development. And then as you go, they're not having to add as much wax. They start to incorporate pupal cocoons. They have silk that goes into the walls. And so they get thicker and thicker over time. But probably where the selection pressure is the strongest is in that colony founding stage, where they have to build it all relatively quickly. And there's thinner walls then, too, and some other different things going on. Yeah. So this is 10 colonies, and generally drone cells and worker cells for each colony. I can't remember I think we did 5 drone and 5 worker, or maybe 10 drone, 10 worker was our target for all of them. Some of them didn't build drone, or they didn't build enough drone cells, and vice versa. And then, like I said, we did some studies where we looked across from the middle to an edge, and once you get to the full edge, that's where they're still building comb, and so you get some different stuff there. So we avoided kind of edges, and we focused on completed cells, mostly in the middle. Well, they build from the top down, but then it kind of, then they have that kind of building horizon. There's no correlation. No, so we didn't find any correlation with these properties. When we did transect, kind of like transect sampling across them from top down and left to right, and then at the ends you see some weird stuff go on, but they're incomplete. And then also where the combs join together, then they have some weird cell things. They start building non-hexagonal cells and some other stuff to join comb, and we avoided those for this study. Yeah. Yeah, and there's like some great work by Michael Smith's lab, he's at Auburn now, and he just had a PNAS paper that came out, and they use these really interesting ways to join comb, which is pretty cool. We've actually done some stuff too, where we've modeled. People have thought that maybe like it's better to have non-perfect honeycomb cells for engineering applications, and that having some stochasticity in the cell shape and size would have a benefit. And we've tested that, so you can basically put these stochastic parameters and have them change, and they actually are all weaker than the regular comb. And so it looks like the regular comb is the ideal. And so even when they're joining them, they're kind of maybe mitigating some of the negative effects of joining them, but it's not better to have joined comb than it would be. With these compressive or tension forces, yeah. Yeah, so there could obviously be, if you start going from different angles, then it could have different effects. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so that's something that we're still exploring. Right now, we just started with these same panels and showed, at least for the stage, it doesn't. But yeah, they're looking at other ways of applying stress. Mm-hmm. And that's all experimental work, so they actually print these out and then crush them. It's not, yeah. Yeah, that could be true. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Is it fair to say each data point?
In this case, within a colony, it could be some bees that overlap. So multiple bees build each cell. We have some work that is just coming out now because we've now looked at some of the building behavior, and they do some interesting stuff to build them. But yeah. Mm-hmm. But so this is just bees. So then what we did is we went to the American Museum of Natural History, which has the largest wasp nest collection available. And so they have all these wasp nests, and we brought our Keonc system with us and then spent a couple weeks there and then tried to image all of the wasp nests that we could get that would actually fit under the machine. They wouldn't let us cut up and break any of these nests, obviously. So, but still, we were able to get 70 different species. So instead of having just one species of Apis mellifera, now we have 71 because we had 70 wasp species. Wasps build their comb with paper. They can build it with mud. They can build it with a combination. So right now, we're still in the process of teasing out some material effects that go into this. We did the same study, and we put it on there. And then now we see a much clearer trend. So when you add all these other species, individual data points here, some of them are resampled within species, but we control that for that in the statistical model we use to analyze this. And this is big, really significant, strongly significant. And so it looks like at least across all bees and wax, there has been selection. So things that use thinner walls do rarely put corner rounding in them, and things that use thicker walls do add more of this corner rounding. So this matches the prediction. And so it looks at like there's maybe less selection within individual species to adjust this, but maybe there's been a selection between species. Also, wax tends to be thicker and mud tends to be thicker. And then the species that build with wax and mud also build more corner rounding. We're in the process now. So our plan was, before COVID happened, to fly to Thailand and then collect as many of the other Apis species that aren't the European honeybee as possible. And then add them to this. And COVID stopped that from happening. But recently, we've been able to get specimens shipped. So now we're looking at dwarf honeybees and giant honeybees and the Asian honeybee and some other stuff. And right now, it looks like across those honeybee species, we've seen the same pattern, that as they build thicker walls, they become more rounded. As they build thinner walls, they're sharper. Okay. So when we look back at this, it does seem that across all of these species, yes, that this is supported, that there is some maybe mechanical effect that is related to the selection of these parameters. But it is mostly between species and not within species is what we're seeing. And then the last thing, and this has nothing to do with the engineering side, my work is interested in understanding the evolution of some of these structures. So we want to know how hexagon cell nests evolve. So we've been putting together, kind of combining different phylogenies within the Hymenoptera of bees and wasps, and then plotting the different cell types and the different nest characteristics across all these species. What was previously known is that there's at least two origins of the hexagon cell within this. One is in the bees, So it's right here in the Apini. The apis bees have the hexagon. They're the only bees that build true hexagonal nests. And then there's another origin in the paper wasp. And so what we found is, yeah, it's clear in the apis there's one origin with this group, and all of the members of that group build hexagon cells. They also have a lot of other similarities. When we're starting to do CT scans of them, and they look very similar in CT scan. And then the idea was that there was one evolution of these hexagon cells in the vespids, but we're actually finding some support that it might have evolved twice within this group, which is pretty interesting. So we have some unresolved phylogenies for this stenogastrine group, the Leostenogaster. But there, it actually looks like it's possible that there's multiple evolutions of honeycomb and losses. They have a bunch of others. They're the ones that build with mud. Sometimes they incorporate like leaves and other things into their nests. So there's something interesting going on there. So we're still kind of piecing this together. But one of the other things that we're able to do is then map some of the transitional steps that led to these based on what extant species do. And so when we look across the phylogeny for bee nest evolution, we see that some of the early ancestors in this that are actually wasps, but they build a simple burrow and they have no cells, so they just lay their eggs in there and they would drag prey, or they would put other food sources in there. The next step up is that they build what we call ovoid cells. So they build, a lot of these are made out of mud, but some of them are made out of cellophane that bees secrete and other different things. And so they have these individual ovoid cells. And the next thing is we see they bifurcate. So one group moves up into trees and arboreal systems and basically builds divisions within tree stems. And so they might have sort of ovoid cells in there as well. And then there's a group here, the Ceratina, that actually lose all this, and then they just lay all their eggs in there. And then the other direction is groups that start to clump these ovoid and then in some cases spheroid cells together. They don't build true hexagons because they are building these full rounded cells. We recently CT scanned some bumblebee colonies, and you can see this really nicely. And then within these groups is where you had the evolution of hexagons just in the apis. We did the same thing with wasp. And it follows almost an identical pattern. There's no extant lineages within this group that don't build cells, so all of the ones that we know of that we could get nest data for already, but they start in the ground and they build these ovoid cells out of mostly mud is what they use. And then there's a similar bifurcation where you have these group of potter wasps that build cells that hang from trees and stuff like that, where they use these spheroid cells. And then this group, then you had some offshoots that then moved into cavity nesting. And then the other way, you had groups that build these aggregations of ovoid cells, and then that's what led to the hexagons. So it's kind of interesting to see this, and this is actually, these steps were actually hypothesized in The Origin of Species by Darwin, and this, to our knowledge, is the first case where people have actually mapped them onto modern phylogenies and then seen more or less what Darwin predicted is correct, as it often is. Okay, so we're still digging into that stuff now. That's sort of ongoing work in my lab. We're trying to put some other traits on that phylogeny and build it out a little bit more. But now I'd like to shift to the work that we've been doing on ants with cuticle sculpturing. So ants have all of these, from a distance, they don't look that different from each other. Everybody, when I tell them I study ants, ask, do I study red ants or black ants, as if there are only two species. But when you look at them under a microscope, you can see all these interesting, intricate patterns, and we call this microsculpturing. These have been really important for taxonomy in ants, and so ants have the number one of all insect of all insect taxonomy. Ants are the go-to book. This book by R.A. Harris that has all the terms to describe all of these different textures and stuff that we see. These are 4 panels from his book. I'd like to ask if any of you would like to guess. These are the 4 words that match with these: rugulos, scabrous, scabriculus, or rugose. Does anyone think they could match any of these with these images? No one's going to try. Yeah, I did this in a room full of ant taxonomists, and they just laughed. No one would do it, right? This is like one of the most frustrating things when you're trying to key out ant species. So this is what those are. Scabriculus and scabrous, those are next to each other. I would not, even having the names next to them, I don't think I can tell. And so this, obviously, it seems to work okay for ant taxonomy. They've come up with over 100 different words for these textures on ants. This is what that glossary that Harris published. There's some really good words in there if you read through them. There's some really creative linguists among ant taxonomists, apparently. But from my lab, we're interested in functional morphology. And so for us, to understand the evolution of these and maybe some functional associations, we wanted to create a more simplified system that could group these together. So my grad student and I have been working over the last 2 years to create 5 categories that these fall into. Smooth is the easiest one. They just have no sculpturing. even though that it's just smooth. There's like, you can see like 15 words to describe smooth, right, that people use. Striate, punctate, reticulate, and tuberous. We used the words for our groups. We basically pulled them from words that already existed from these that are below. We didn't want to introduce new terminology. There's probably enough. And then just to show what these look like, this is our sort of wheel of ant textures that we've developed. So smooth is at the top. That's the simplest. It's usually smooth and shiny. They don't have any sculpturing. Reticulate are kind of netted patterns. So you have longitudinal and transverse lines that cross each other. Striate is when you have these longitudinal lines that cover the body. Punctate is dimples, like a golf ball, kind of like golf ball dimples. And then the last one is tuberous, and these are, it's hard to see in here a little bit, but they're these kind of spines or tubercles that stick out of the body that are raised. And so we took these and then had to test whether these groups actually captured ant diversity. So that's my graduate student at the top left. That's JP, and these are two undergrads in my lab that worked with him. And so they went through a whole series of ants, and then they after they kind of developed these systems, they would test them out. So this ant, does anyone want to guess what would we call this one? Striate, yeah. So everyone would come up and say striate, 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 and then we would say, okay, we have 100% consensus. Then we had some other ones that were maybe more difficult. What about this one? Striate, reticulate, punctate, smooth, tuberous. So this one, we might have had a mix, right? So maybe two people said reticulate. Some person was looking right in the center and might have said striate. So we kind of worked through these categories to kind of sharpen the language and the definitions. Ultimately, all of these students worked together to look at almost 3,000 species from 13 genera. We use antweb.org, so all these images are available online. And then ultimately, as we refined the system, we got to 90% agreement when they looked at new groups. So they seem relatively robust. And then some of the ones they disagree on are ones that have like two. So there might be half their head is striate and half their head is reticulate, and it's hard to classify things like that. So there's some variation, and just like some ants probably don't actually fit well into categories. Then the next step was to do this for every ant species. And my grad student wasn't looking for it. He had already done 3,000. There's 15,000 ant species. So he started working with a computer scientist at Kennesaw State that does machine learning, particularly for identifying textures. And they started to work on this. To my knowledge, they're still working on this and haven't figured it out. And my student has to graduate this summer. So he did just like man up and then identify 12,000 ant species himself and went through AntWeb to do all of them. So the data I'm going to show is from that. So we took all of those different categories and we mapped them onto a current ant phylogeny. You can't see too much here, but there's pie charts, and each of those show the relative proportion of these different sculpturings within each genera. So a couple things I'll point out. If you zoom in at the top of this tree, all the basal lineages are smooth. So even though to ant taxonomists, ants are famous for having all these textures, it looks like they evolved smooth, or they evolved from smooth ancestors. And that's true if you look at, we started to look at some amber ants, some fossil ants. These are two of the oldest fossil lineages. They're also all smooth. And then we also did some phylogenetic reconstruction stuff, and it looks like basically right now we have 100% support that the earliest ants were smooth. Another thing that we noticed is, a lot of these different cuticle traits evolve multiple times independently in ants. There's one exception to that, and this tuberous structure is associated mostly with leafcutter ants and fungus farming ants. So this group has these tuberous structures. It might have something to do, particularly trachymyrmex and acromyrmex have these mutualisms where they cultivate a bacteria on their bodies that you can see in this ant here. That's what all that white is. So there could be some associations with having some of this rough sculpturing that could help the bacteria adhere. We don't really know that yet, but that's something that could be interesting. And then the last thing is sort of the middle of this phylogeny. There's several big subfamilies that are almost all smooth. And so we were trying to figure out why some of the most successful groups of ants did not evolve any of this sculpturing. And one of the things that we found is that sculpturing tends to be associated. So it's these two groups, dolichoderines and formicines. These two groups have very low levels of sculpturing within them compared to some of the other ones. When we looked across these, what we found are some differences in cuticle thickness. So ants that have thicker cuticle are more likely to be sculptured. Ants that have thin cuticle are not sculptured. So there seems to be something going on there with the evolution of sculpturing that it requires. At this stage, we think they require some thickness for this stuff to actually evolve. And I'm trying to wrap up fast here because I know you guys got to get out of here. And so we've been looking, we're working on a review paper that we're getting ready to submit hopefully next week, looking at some of the hypotheses for function of these. One is that this is a picture of shark skin, so there's some antimicrobial effects of nanosculpturing that have been identified potentially from sharks and from insect wings and different things. Currently, we don't have evidence that the ant textures are at this scale, so we don't see evidence for antimicrobial activity. We do see some evidence that maybe that this sculpturing could allow beneficial microbes to adhere. And so we've seen this in some other groups as well, that maybe being textured helps you have support beneficial microbes on the external exoskeleton. Another one, there could be something to do with structure. So we know corrugated patterns are used like in cardboard to strengthen it. So there could be some stiffness properties that are increased by having this. This hasn't been tested yet, but this is one of the hypotheses. And the one that we've been interested in is abrasion resistance. So this is the one that we've been studying in my lab in a little bit more detail lately. Ants dig, and so a lot of ants dig. Some do, some don't. But the ones that dig would be exposed to abrasion from soil. And there's been some work by Bob Johnson that showed, here's some SEM work. This is before and after digging. So you can actually see some little chunks taken out of the cuticle down there. So there is abrasion that happens. And this is also associated with water loss. So if they do get abraded, they have higher levels of water loss and higher levels of mortality. So there's reasons that ants should want to reduce this abrasion. So what we've been doing is I had the two undergrads I showed before, this is their project. They've been going through AntWeb and measuring the width of striated ants. So the width of the striations and then the width in between those striations. We've looked at this across body size. So you would predict, as body size increases, if there wasn't any stabilizing selection, then you would see like 1-to-1 increase maybe in this interridge width. What we see is that there is a significant effect. Bigger ants have wider space striations. But there's a lot of noise in this, and the slope is really minor. So there's not a lot of increase. So what we actually think is that there is some stabilizing selection to keep the width of the inner width rich a certain width. Interestingly, that falls under, that's the smallest grain of a sand grain, basically, right there. And so almost all of these fall under the width of the smallest grain of sand. So basically, sand could not fit in there and scrape in between these ridges. So this is some support that there might be an abrasion resistance effect. And then we've also dug a little bit back into Bob Johnson's work. And so he did research on two species. Both of them have slight striations, but one is smoother than the other. So you have striated Pogonomyrmex barbatus, and then more smooth Veramessa purgandii. And just reanalyzing some of his data, what we found is that after digging, the same experience of digging, the smooth ants lose a lot more water. So they have more water loss that's been tied back to abrasion. So it seems like there is some support here that having these microsculpturing patterns could reduce abrasion and then could have benefits by decreasing water loss rates and stuff like that. And then the very last thing I want to mention is that we've just found these things beautiful, and we ended up working with with a textile designer. This is Meredith West in the center, to actually start digging into some of these patterns. And she went through AntWeb and found what she thought were the coolest looking ants, and then would create pattern repeats. So then we would end up with these basically textile prints where we could print things out. We've taken those, and then she's put all these cool different color patterns with them. And we opened a shop, and it's sort of an outreach project, but through Threadless. And so we sell these under the brand name Holotype. We have a series. I think we have 4 species that we include in this. That she did 6, but I think we selected down. And so we sold masks when that was a big thing with COVID, but we're doing pillows and a bunch of other things. So there's a lot of cool things you can do when you kind of zoom in and look at ants under a microscope. Okay, so with that, I'll just thank everybody and open it up for questions if there's still some time. Yeah. It can, yeah. It's like funny enough, there was a debate on Twitter I saw yesterday where someone posted a picture of an ant they were trying to describe taxonomically, and they were like, how would you describe this texture? And then people pulled up their glossaries, and then there were like 20 different answers, right? So, I mean, I think that there is some precision there that some people understand, maybe, but there's also a lot of overlap. Yeah.
Jasmine said you should try to repeat
Oh, okay.
Oh, no,
Repeat
I
this
just wanna
section.
hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll repeat it. Yeah, so the question are some digging ants or are ants that don't dig smooth, more likely to be smooth? Not always, so it's not an absolute rule, but we've been now diving into this. So that's what the second sort of half of my grad student is working on. So he's been pulling this onto some species level phylogenies. There is a trend, and so in certain groups, there's only 3 great species level phylogenies we can compare, or 2, actually, there's only 2. And in one of them, it's very strong association that smooth ants are much more likely to be arboreal and unlikely to be ground nesting. In the other one, there's slight support, but it's more mixed. So we're kind of digging into that. But what we really think is that these are multifunctional characters, and so they might evolve for different reasons. We also think there's a cost to being rough, which is it's more difficult for them to clean themselves. And there's some work comparing them to termites, which are really perfectly smooth, and termites are really good at getting pathogens off their bodies. And some of these other ants seem like they might have more trouble with that. Yeah. Jennifer? So what we think is going on for it is that they have these higher level ridges, and the primary type of soil that abrades is sand. And so what we think is happening is basically the sand can scrape sort of on those ridges and abrade them, but they're protected underneath those ridges. And so ants and insects in general, they secrete a wax layer on their cuticle, and that's the primary thing that they use to keep water in, this cuticular hydrocarbon level and layer. And so what we think is the cuticular hydrocarbons are protected in between those ridges. And so even if they do get some abrasion to the ridges, they're not losing that much water because those areas are probably thickened already. And then it also doesn't require them to keep secreting more cuticular hydrocarbons. They can basically groom themselves after and kind of pull those waxes from the interridge and then cover them. That's a very speculative mechanism, but that's the way we've been thinking. We also found, just recently, we analyzed this and found that small ants are more likely to be smooth and lack sculpturing. And some of these is interesting because they are under the size where sand could even abrade them. Like a grain of sand is like the same size of their entire head. And so they wouldn't have that same abrasion, stress potentially on them because they just pick one sand grain up at a time and they're not running into it the same way. Yeah.
So with some species of ants, they have crazy lights, like polyrhacus.
Yeah, so we don't so that's like true sculpturing, and so we've redefined as microsculpturing. But the idea with polyrhacus is that it prevents birds from eating it, that there's some defensive thing that they would get caught in the necks of birds, why theirs are so crazy. Some of the spikes protect regions of the body that are easier for other ants to chew through. That's why they typically stick out over the petiole. Things like that. So there's an idea that there's, some protective benefit to those. Yeah. And it could be muscle attachment. We've been considering that inside, we don't really know too much about what they look like inside, and there could be things going on there.
Jeanette, you have a question. Hey, Jeanette, can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
We can't hear your voice.
You can.
But okay, well, I'll read your question. On beetle carapaces, there are hexagons and flat parts of the carapace versus pentagons on the curved sections. Are there similar patterns in honeycomb?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. So in honeycomb, it typically is pretty regular, but they do have rounding. So if you look at them and from the side, they are slightly rounded, but they still build all hexagons. They just kind of expand them out. But they do, once you get to where 2 of those combs join together, then they do start to build pentagons, in some cases 7-sided structures, and 3-sided structures. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. She heard that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some mathematical relationship. Oh, you can't hear me.
Yeah, great question. So the question was, there is a hypothesis in the bee literature that the hexagons, So I'm kind of rephrasing this a little bit, but the hypothesis is that the hexagons arise as a result of the material properties of wax, because when the bees build it, they just heat their bodies up, and as wax melts, it just will form a hexagon. And this goes back to like Darcy Thompson and all these people who've been thinking about this 100 years ago. And there's been some papers that have found that the bees do heat up their bodies a little bit, and that might make wax more malleable. There's two arguments why it's unlikely that is true and explains the hexagon. We think that, really the bees are building hexagons. It's not just an emergent property. One is that wasps build hexagons, and they do so out of paper, right? And so even if that explained it in bees, it wouldn't explain it in wasps. The second one is that the material properties of wax, their melting point for them to be malleable is higher than the temperature of the bees. And so there's actually no physical mechanism that could explain how they would be able to melt it to that degree. I think there's some recent research that's come out on that. And then the third one is now we have a Ph.D. student who is part of the NASA project who's been CT scanning comb through time to look at building behaviors, and it's very clear how they actually, the steps are becoming more clear how they actually, where they add wax. They basically add these little clumps of kind of non-compressed wax, and then they press it into the walls, and then at the end it looks like a little matchstick in cross section. So it's the walls below the top are thinner, and then they have this thickened area on the top. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, when the bees produce the wax, is it produced at a higher temperature? Is there something else that makes it more malleable when they come out? I don't know enough about that to give you a really great answer, but that's come up before. People have asked, like, how are they extruding this wax from their bodies? Because it obviously becomes more solid after they apply it to the comb. I mean, it's going to be a little bit warmer, so their body temperature maybe a little bit warmer, but yeah, I don't know the mechanism. There's something that's happening that they're obviously secreting. It's kind of a liquid form, and then it comes into a solid form. Yeah.
Okay, let's give Clint one last round of applause. That was a great talk.